Before I introduce our three speakers, I would like to introduce Beryl Flom, who is the chair of the Immigration and Deportation Policies Committee of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. I don't know if you can see her, but Beryl and I will moderate the Q&A portion of this webinar. In addition to being members of the League of Women Voters of San Diego, Beryl and I are also members of the steering committee of the LWVUS Immigration Interest Group, which is composed of League members from states across the country who work together to keep abreast of this topic and to strategize about action on all levels of government. We have a Google group for sharing information, and if you would like to join, please contact me. I will put my email address in the chat. Our three speakers will talk for about an hour, and then we will have a Q&A period for about a half hour. We are really delighted to have such experts on both the national and local aspects of this ever-evolving issue. Polo Morales is the Director of External Affairs for CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, whose mission is to advance the human and civil rights of immigrants and refugees, and it has a national presence. Chris Olson is the Chief of Staff at Jewish Family Service in San Diego and is responsible for all policy and advocacy work for this organization, which does extensive work with migrants and immigrants in the San Diego area. And Jesse Imbriano is the legal director of Casa Cornelia Law Center in San Diego, a public interest law firm which has a primary commitment to indigent persons within the immigrant community in Southern California. So Polo, I'd like to turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane, and it's a pleasure to be here with the League once again. Always a pleasure to be here in everybody's company. I'm going to go into the time travel machine and go back to the 2020 presidential election. And so back then, we were facing an uncertain future in terms of where this country was headed. We saw 4 years of very heavy-handed anti-immigrant policies during the Trump administration. And so the light at the end of the tunnel seemed to be this new approach by, then candidate Biden to be able to address the issue of immigration. And so this is something that has always been, at the forefront of all political issues. Folks that want to get elected either denigrate it or they're championing it. And sometimes they're just kind of standing by the sidelines. And so this is a very contentious issue. And so as the election panned out and, campaign promises were made during this time. So President Biden did make a campaign promise that, with the new Congress, they were going to get immigration reform done. And so that would be providing a path to citizenship for the 11 million, addressing, the dreamers and the DACA recipients, addressing folks that have temporary protective status. All these promises were made in order to, right something that hasn't been fixed in a very, very long time. And so as, things developed, there was an introduction of different bills, which we saw, which was great to see, right? There was some progress, the asylum and refugee issues that we had seen under the Trump administration. We were seeing that, system really be dismantled and destroyed. And so this was an opportunity to build up, to be able to, bring back the status quo, at least as a foundation, and build upon it into the future. So there was a lot of hope that things would be different under this new administration. And so along with addressing some of these issues, we saw the introduction of the U.S. Citizenship Act. And so that was a plan of how we could address the system itself. What was interesting about the U.S. Citizenship Act and this campaign promise to address, the 11 undocumented folks living in the U.S. was that we didn't see the punitive, more border enforcement, we need to, increase the deportations. Like none of that was part of the U.S. Citizenship Act in the way that we had seen different iterations of any legalization bill. And so that seemed to signal to us a very positive step in the right direction. And so as time went on, political capital starts, it's the diminishing returns, right? We start seeing that, even though we had some other pieces of legislation introduced, the Essential Workers Act, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, the Dream and Promise Act. I know we're going through memory lane, right? Those beautiful times when we're looking at these bills going, wow, this is, really great to see some advancement on the issue of immigration. And so as, we soon found out is the House was willing to move some of these bills forward. We had some champions in the Senate, including Senator Padilla here in California, who's really been taking this issue head on, which is great to see. But we found ourselves in that 50-50 situation, and I would say more like a 48-52 situation, in which two, Democrats, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, were not moving forward, any piece of legislation, it seemed at that time. And so we were being very creative and trying to create enough pressure to move a larger piece of immigration reform forward. When that didn't come about into 2021, folks, we started re-strategizing into 2022 and started looking at what else is possible, right? And so that included in the list of bills was also an effort being led by CHIRLA and other organizations across the country around registry, updating the registry date to be able to change existing law, which is already in the books. It's been existing since 1929. Change the date to be able to include the folks that are undocumented, and then make sure that that is a rolling registry date and that gets updated automatically into the future if immigration is going to be used as a political football forevermore. And so that was the idea back then. It was existing law, et cetera. There was a whole campaign that built around it. So as different national organizations started positioning themselves, and as we got closer towards the 2022 elections, and we had no idea what was going to happen, right? Would the Republicans win both the Senate and the House? Would they set themselves up for winning the presidency in 2024? As you can see, we've saw where the chips have landed now, which I'll get into in just a little bit. But as things were ramping up towards the end of the year, different organizations were looking, what do we prioritize, right? Do we focus on a very narrow, specific win, or do we try to go for the larger, much bigger effort? And so all that to say, we had some opportunities with the omnibus bill last year. And so, and it's only a couple of weeks ago, so just it seems like last year seems like such a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. We were biting our nails trying to figure out, is there an opportunity to include the Dream and Promise Act or some kind of a DACA fix? There was conversations that Senator Sinema was having with the Republicans. In the middle of these conversations, she decided to flip parties, or actually just become an independent. And so that negotiation for the Democrats seemed kind of moot at that point. But what we did see was at least a conversation around maintaining Title 42, which would be used, and cemented into law to be able to exclude folks that are coming into our southern border who are seeking asylum. So a continuation of the Trump policies to prevent folks from applying for asylum. And so the border issue became the primary focus. And then attached to that, it seems most national organizations seem to align, including the League, around that DACA fix, right, or that DREAM component. Can we get something done? And so at the end of the day, when the votes came down, what we saw was there wasn't enough votes to be able to move this approach forward. What we did see was an attempt to include Title 42 as an amendment in the omnibus bill, and Senator Sinema introduced that. It got the support of 8 Democrats, but it failed to pass. And this was without any positive pro-immigrant piece of legislation included. So it looks like our primary negotiator who went independent really didn't see the totality of what we're trying to accomplish. But we were fortunate that did not go through. Folks have the legal right to present themselves at any border seeking asylum, and we want to make sure that is upheld, and that process is one in which folks can step into much easier than we've seen over the course of these past years. So we ended up with the omnibus bill getting passed without anything being attached to it. And so the good news about the omnibus bill is there was an additional $5 million for citizenship. So there's organizations across the country that can tap into those funds to be able to provide low cost or no cost support for folks to become citizens, and then some funding for the backlog. As you know, there are hundreds of thousands of folks that are still waiting to become citizens. This was a backlog that it worsened under the Trump administration. It hasn't been fully addressed during this current administration, but more funds means more opportunities to be able to change that. And so that brings us to 2023. So where are we at? we are in a split house, right? A Senate and a House. We have Speaker McCarthy now, after 15 times, I guess 15 times the charm to become Speaker here. Um, and some concessions that were made, including immigration, right? So we can expect that there's going to be some anti-immigrant bills that are going to be introduced. Some of them have been attempted to be introduced, especially around asylum and Title 42. We're starting to see that there isn't enough votes to be able to move some of this anti-immigrant energy forward, which is interesting to say the least. Did the Republicans learn their lesson in 2022 in terms of setting themselves up for trying to keep the House or win the Senate? Is too far right too much now? Is more of a moderate stance going to be something that can pay off in the future? We don't know where that conversation lies, but we do know that there's a very small minority of Republicans that can, derail efforts very, very easily. So, we're kind of a wait and see pattern right now on how that gets addressed. But some of the important things that we are seeing this year and when we started seeing last year, if folks ask me what is, President Biden doing on immigration, is it good or bad? I would answer that the same way that I used to anticipate, when I would wait for the ice cream man to come by. We had these little yellow bags that had happy faces on them called grab bags when I was a kid in the 1980s. And for a quarter, you would get your grab bag and you didn't know what was in the grab bag. But hopefully it was some kind of a candy or a toy. Who knew? So this grab bag, so that's your vote. How we get our grab bag. The grab bag seems to be a little bit mixed when it comes to immigration. We're starting to see, the administration could have said we're ending Title 42 and, we're doing everything that we can to end Title 42, but they decided to let it run its course through the courts. And so that's an example of, there's an issue, it's too hot, we don't want to touch it, so we'll just leave it up to the courts to sort that out. We have seen some implementation of some executive orders, that are positive, right, in a good light, that don't continue, this, the previous 4 years or actually, the Trump administration's policies. But some simple things such as like the refugee sponsorship program. So we just were part of some conversations. There was a national call and explaining what families here in the U.S. could sponsor a refugee family, and that would facilitate finding housing and providing some help in that, which other folks can get into in terms of the practical application of that later on in this call. The other is worker protections, which are also being upheld. We're still, and the creation of this program, which we discussed, or I should mention is, you need an app to be able to apply. You need to be able to fly into a port of entry. And, there's like a cap of 30,000 people that could apply for this. The reality of that is when you set such a high bar and you have to apply for your whole home country, which complicates things because we already have a bunch of folks that are at our southern border. There's a backlog there because of the Trump administration and its many years of the Remain in Mexico policy. So are these folks supposed to go back to their home country, download the app, and then submit paperwork to CBP? The practical application of that is a big question mark. And so we're seeing a little bit of a continuation of like dragging the feet, right? This mixed bag that we're getting, some good things, but other things that are making it much more difficult for folks to apply for asylum. So we are seeing folks, be able to go in or come into the U.S. and get, have sponsors and whatnot. What we are seeing also is with this new policy, how does it actually pan out? What does it look like? And so all this under, we got 2 more years entering into the next presidential election, up until we get into 2024. What is that going to look like? Where are we going to land with this immigration issue? Will there be attempts to try to move pieces of legislation with a Republican House? Are they going to be willing to play ball? We're not quite sure. And so this is, this is where we find ourselves right now. And so as a national immigrant rights organization, and folks working in different capacities, we're all trying to figure out like, what is there anything feasible? And if there isn't, then how do we use this time and moment to be able to plant seeds, to be able to see if we can move something, when we get into 2025 and beyond. So that's not to say we're not going to have to fight, to maintain some level of status quo or to better conditions, because that's always the case. But it could be that this fight is going to be about anti-immigrant bills that are presented in the House of Representatives, that the Senate could quite possibly take up, given the upcoming election and the 8 or so Democrat Senate seats that the Democrats are trying to protect. And so it's going to take a village to be able to fight back and really create the public pressure to, make sure that they understand they need to vote no, because that's not the solution. We need a path to citizenship. We need to approach the system in a much larger degree than we have in many, many years. And so, what's been the race to kind of like narrow down the win, maybe it's time to broaden it up and really start bringing more folks into the fold to be able to organize and be able to make some headway into this issue. So yeah, I wish I had good news, but back, I don't know if I have more time or anything, but Jane, pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a terrific summary of a very complicated set of issues, and we can dig more into them, when we get to the Q&A. And there already are questions. People should be, thinking of some, because there may be certain aspects of this that people would really like to hear more. But let's go on and hear from Chris Olson a little more about the local scene and what he's seeing, especially, here at the border. Chris, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Jane, and to the League and to everyone attending tonight. My name is Chris Olson. I'm Chief of Staff for Jewish Family Service of San Diego. We're a nonprofit organization in San Diego, over 100 years old, founded founded in 1918 by a group of Jewish women, beginning work on border issues, helping Jews at that time who were without resources and stuck on the Mexican side of the border to have assistance coming into the United States and to improve their lives. And we've continued that work of welcoming the stranger for over 100 years. And it's an integral part of our work here in San Diego in this current moment where immigration is at the front of so many folks' minds. And we're proud to partner with the other groups on this call. Thanks, Polo, for setting the stage legislatively. I'd like to use the time to share a little bit about what we see on the ground, the work we're doing, and some of the advocacy pushes that we have as an organization in partnership with the Rapid Response Network. I might use the terms JFS and the Rapid Response Network a little bit interchangeably during my presentation. The Rapid Response Network is a coalition of human rights, service, and faith organizations that was founded in 2017 to address and monitor increased immigration enforcement that was going on at that time in our county, and to come up with a humanitarian response that reaffirms the value that San Diego is and has always been a border community. We're a community that welcomes, and we're a community that thrives when everyone is given an equal opportunity to pursue their dreams and have their basic needs met and pursue justice. So our core partners are of ourselves, Jewish Family Service, and also the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties, SEIU Local 221, and Southwestern College. I'll just start by kind of describing the work we do each day. Every day, the Rapid Response Network's shelter, which is operated by us, Jewish Family Service, welcomes approximately 200 vulnerable asylum seekers, primarily families with young children, who have been released into our care by the Department of Homeland Security. And then when they're released to our care, our shelter services operate in a respite shelter model where folks who have been processed and released by Department of Homeland Security, a number of ways that could happen. Currently, a large portion of those individuals are because of problems with and backlog in the asylum process are released on humanitarian parole. And we, as JFS, are able to provide transportation to our shelter, which is currently in a repurposed hotel due to shifting to respond to COVID protocols. We used to have a congregate shelter, like a large gymnasium style building with beds. And then we switched during COVID to a hotel model where people have individual rooms for safety and for public health. So we provide transportation to, and this is all optional, of course, transportation to our hotel shelter. And there, in partnership with the state of California, we're able to provide medical screenings, testing and vaccination for COVID-19, screening for a variety of other health issues, because folks have often been either traveling long distances on foot or waiting on the Mexico side for quite some time without adequate access to food, water, and medical care. Prescriptions have run out. Some folks may be pregnant or expecting to give birth soon, all sorts of situations. So we're able to provide that medical screening in partnership with UC San Diego and provide meals and a safe place to sleep. And most importantly, legal assistance in terms of knowing the next steps in their asylum hearing process, and travel assistance. Well over 90% of the guests that we receive into our care each day have a final destination in the United States that's somewhere other than California. And a large part of the operation is assisting folks in arranging travel by bus, by air, to wherever their final destination is in the country to meet their point of contact or family member in the United States. And we've perfected that over the years with partnerships such as Miles for Migrants, and also a really successful partnership with United Airlines, who's been able to creatively increase their capacity to serve our guests and also provide discounts to us as an agency in terms of this humanitarian relief response. And we've gotten to the point now where we're able, as many people as we can travel out onto their final destination. That means that same day we can welcome that much more capacity into the shelter, up to 200 people per night on average. Folks stay with us for a relatively short amount of time, maybe one night or a few nights, before being able to have that health assessment completed, have onward travel coordinated, and kind of regain stability and a sense of peace of mind. One of the first things we notice when folks arrive at the shelter, and we have multilingual briefings and welcome messages given in Spanish, Russian, Ukrainian, Haitian Creole, is a look of relief when we reinforce over and over that they're no longer in a custodial setting, that they are with a nonprofit humanitarian organization, that they're free to do as they wish, and that we're there to meet their needs and to offer help. And that realization of a long and arduous journey finally being over is very impactful to our team and to our volunteers. Recognizing the journey is far from totally over, but up to that point, it's a very significant milestone in someone's journey. A little bit about how all this operation works, and the kind of interplay between the government and nonprofit sectors, I think is illuminating. The work that we do is really an example of, I think, civil society stepping in to fill a gap where government's responsibility has broken down. The federal government is in charge, obviously, of immigration policy, and ideally would be the branch of government that would have a comprehensive solution and a system of infrastructure to uphold its commitments to human rights and to an asylum process. However, that's not the case. For hundreds of folks that are released into our care, were it not for the nonprofit sector, and it's not just us at Jewish Family Service, it's also Catholic Charities and a number of other nonprofit organizations doing this work. Were it not for us, those folks would be on the streets of San Diego with no resources, no information, potentially separated from family members, and with no way to identify the best next step. So it's critical that all of us as informed citizens make that known to our elected officials at all levels of government. And like Polo said, it's a mixed bag. There's people who get it, and then there's folks who don't. We're very fortunate to be in the state of California, where we have leaders in the Senate, particularly Senator Padilla, who are really strong leaders in this area. And we also have the support of our state legislature and governor, who have invested tens of millions of state resources into this humanitarian effort. Our shelter at JFS is one of several TVRCs, which is a testing, vaccination, and resource center located in Riverside, Imperial, and San Diego counties that are stepping up to the need, giving services to folks released by the federal government with no other option, and preventing, frankly, street homelessness among a population for whom there is no need for that to happen. Just last month in December, our shelter celebrated our 4-year anniversary of operating. And with that, it coincided with welcoming our 100,000th guest. So we're proud to say, with the support of our donors, our volunteers, partners at the state, local, and federal government, we've that 100,000 number represents 100,000 folks that would have been sleeping on the streets of San Diego with no resources in a time where public health was obviously a paramount concern, and we're really proud of that work. The interplay between politics and all of this is pretty interesting. One thing that we share in terms of our ability to fund this work is, of course, the significant investment by the state government, which we're very grateful for. But there's also an interesting piece, which is the federal government's funding of border response work and humanitarian work through FEMA, through the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, which is referred to by its acronym EFSP. Interestingly enough, EFSP funds have been made available in both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And they are made available to NGOs and government organizations along the border to provide exactly what the name says, emergency food and shelter assistance. It is a key component, but it is not sufficient in terms of responding to the need of border communities and the needs of migrants asserting their legal right to seek asylum in the United States. I say that because the amount of money is not sufficient on its own, and two, it's not. Although the work that we do, we're very proud of, and organizations like us do this all across the southern border. Throwing money at the problem and allowing and leaving it to civil society to solve the problem isn't a true comprehensive infrastructure to address the situation long term. Grants from the federal government and other levels of government, such as EFSP, are continually renewed on a temporary basis, sometimes through continuing resolutions through Congress with no clear foresight of what will be happening in the future, or on an annual basis, and don't establish any kind of government-led response, such as, that a contrast could be seen here in San Diego with the way that the federal government responded to the unaccompanied minors situation. We as JFS did not, we weren't the provider for that particular population, but in that instance, when the convention center in downtown San Diego was repurposed to serve unaccompanied minors and to really have a whole of government response, that response looked different. That response was, of course, federal funding, but also federal employees, resources, contracts, equipment, leasing of space, a true whole of government response. And for the work that we have done for over 4 years now, and other organizations are doing, it is just a reimbursement. It's just pots of money being made available, and it's left up to organizations or their states, if they have a cooperative state like California, to find the providers, to hire staff, to find the space, which is extremely difficult in San Diego, and to keep the operation going, and to have no long-term timeline of how that will go. But I'm not trying to be too negative. We're really, really grateful for the support of our local delegation here in San Diego County, in Congress, in the state legislature, and quite frankly, just the civic community. The fact that we're invited here by the League, we're very grateful for, to share this information. We're grateful for a number of local news outlets who have done very smart reporting, including the Union Tribune and the LA Times, to give a sense of the real impact to our region and the opportunity that we have to make transformative change for folks who are asserting their legal rights, and the opportunity for us as a community to live up to the commitments of our values. A couple advocacy points I did want to bring up and tee up for further discussion later. Polo mentioned the omnibus bill that was passed last month. There, in terms of shelter provider, that was a great win on a couple fronts. One, obviously killing the poison amendments to codify Title 42. Those were defeated, thankfully, although that's a threat that looms still on the horizon. And the federal government's investment budget-wise into the EFSP program, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, hit a record high, actually. There was an appropriation made of over $700 million. It's the highest that's ever been. Granted, that's for the entire border from California to Texas. So it's a lot of geography to cover, but the willingness of Congress to put that into appropriations was really welcome. But as with everything in that surprise plastic bag he was talking about, it came with some caveats. The program is currently administered by FEMA, which we believe is appropriate because it is a humanitarian and emergency response agency. But the bill contained language that, along with this large appropriation of funds, the program is set to transfer from FEMA to Customs and Border Patrol beginning in June of this year. And there was no real clear administrative direction given, or policy direction given in the language, other than, quote, the funds were to support the depopulation of CBP facilities. That is obviously open to a lot of interpretation, and we at JFS and other organizations and activists that do this work are going to be looking very closely to the administration to see how they plan to implement that change of allocation of funds from one department to the other. We contend that the EFSP must retain its focus on providing critical shelter and humanitarian work, and that that response be continue to be humanitarian and not enforcement related, and that in the long term, a multi-year sustainable approach to funding and building capacity along the border is really the long-term goal. And that we have proven that, at least over the past several years, trust is built with partnerships with trusted nonprofit organizations and organizations with actual community roots in our communities, more than a law enforcement agency to carry out the goals of the EFSP program. And one other tidbit on the state front, as I said, we've been very fortunate and grateful to receive support through the state's budget process for several years now for the testing, vaccination, and resource centers, of which JFS's shelter is one. We will be closely monitoring the state's budget process this year. The state opted not to include updated figures on its investment in the migrant shelter and testing and vaccination and resource center network. They opted not to include an update for that in the proposed budget. However, it was noted that it will be included as part of the May revision instead. So we're very hopeful and optimistic about that. And it's something that we'll be monitoring moving forward. And that's it for now. I'll pause.
Chris, thank you so much. I think Polo gave us the big picture, and you really gave us more the picture from the ground level, as well as some great information about the state role. Terrific. So, Jesse, I'm hoping you may blend a little of each. So over to you.
I'll do my best. Well, I thank the League for the invitation to join today. as was mentioned earlier, I work at Casa Cornelia Law Center. We're a law firm here in San Diego. We've been around for about 30 years. And during that time, our focus has always been on providing legal representation to those individuals who the law recognizes are eligible for a humanitarian protection. And what I'm going to try to do, and that work has since the beginning included asylum seekers, folks who were fleeing to the US. And we've been able for those 30 years to provide free legal representation to many of these folks. What I'm going to try to do is put a little bit of context to what's been shared so far, and offer a little bit about why we're seeing what we're seeing from the asylum perspective, and why, for example, JFS is seeing all those sheltered guests, all of those folks who are coming through and are in need of that kind of support. I think it's relatively uncontroversial to say that the immigration system we have was built for a different time and a different moment. The United States has recognized humanitarian protections for certain non-citizens really only for a few decades. So the asylum law as we know it today was defined by the international community in 1951 and wasn't put into US law until 1980. Other humanitarian protections that exist, special immigrant juvenile status for abused and abandoned children was put into the law in 1990. U visas and T visas for trafficking and crime victims were put into the law in 2000. Protections for domestic violence survivors put into the law in 1994. A short period of time that these sorts of humanitarian protections were recognized. The law that we're operating under today in its architecture more or less has existed since 1996. And it was built for a non-citizen population very different than what we're seeing today. The individuals, the non-citizens that immigration officers were coming into contact with were primarily single adult men. The law presumed that those individuals were only coming to the United States for economic reasons, frankly. The law presumed that those individuals would not qualify for any protection here in the United States, that they would be very, very quickly returned to their country of origin. If coming from Mexico within a matter of hours, coming from other countries, perhaps in a matter of days. For many of them, the law did not give even an opportunity to see an immigration judge and to explain why they were coming to the United States. And the infrastructure was built around that. So the infrastructure was built with cells along the southwest border where these most commonly single adult men would be held for a matter of hours. And that's been going on since 1996. That system, the system that we inherited, those doing this work today, are still operating in a system which is, Polo talked about, there really hasn't been any substantive change to in decades. And the problem with that, I mean, there's many of problems with that, but the problem that we face today is the reality of non-citizens arriving to the United States has fundamentally changed in the last 3 or 4 decades. So the number of single adult males arriving by themselves, expressing a desire to work and maybe return home, has proportionally actually significantly decreased if you look at the average over the last 20 years. What we've instead seen, and we hear about historic numbers at our southwest border, we see an incredible increase in the number of unaccompanied children arriving to our southern border. Children primarily, though not exclusively, from Central America. That the age, that if you look at the demographic shift, the ages of those children are average younger than they were for many decades. They're no longer, primarily older teen boys, but they're younger children. Many more of the children arriving are girls, and that's a trend that we saw during the Obama administration, and that never abated. So we went in 2010, 2011, 2012 to maybe 10,000 unaccompanied children arriving per year. In 2013 and 2014, we shot up to 60 and 70,000 per year. And those numbers haven't changed. And so those children arriving were arriving to a system that wasn't built, wasn't prepared for children. A few years later, we saw a different shift. Suddenly, we saw family groups arriving in incredibly not large numbers. Some women with children, some men with children, some two partners arriving with children, but arriving again in unprecedented numbers. And again, our system wasn't built for families at the southwest border. There is actually some family detention in the country, not here in California. In Texas, there have been a few centers where families were detained in immigration custody. But certainly, I mean, the humanity of detaining families, just like children, is problematic from a humane standpoint. But there was no system in place for that. But I think the biggest change that we saw during the last few years is this: more people than ever were fleeing. They were expressing that they were not coming primarily for economic reasons. And some really powerful work was done primarily by UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, speaking with these folks, consistently hearing stories of people fleeing failed states, places where it was no longer safe for them to reside. And so a system that was built for asylum being the exception was now suddenly seeing asylum as a request for asylum being the norm, that the majority of folks suddenly there were explicitly expressing upon arrival to the United States that they were in danger and that they were fleeing and that they were seeking protection here in the United States. And certainly our adjudication system was not built for that. The backlog of cases in the asylum space has increased exponentially from 2 administrations ago to the last administration, and continues to grow. Despite efforts to build more courts, to put more judges on the bench, that growth has in cases has continued because of this consistent reality that individuals are on the run. Every statistic that looks objectively at this will say that worldwide, more people are in flight than at any time in history since the Second World War. That's a startling number, that so many of those folks are arriving to the U.S. and seeking protection here because they feel that there's no alternative. So I think it's important that then we look at what the administrations have tried to do to address this. 2 administrations ago, during the Obama administration, the effort was to be tough on border enforcement. Many of us will remember pejoratives for President Obama being called the deporter in chief, and a trade-off was made. That is, that enforcement at the border would be strengthened, that those arriving would be quickly subject to deportation if they could be, in exchange for a more humane approach to those with long histories here in the United States. During the last administration, we saw a very different approach. The approach was that everyone subject to removal, new arrivals, those at the border, would be, and those here in the interior would be subject to as aggressive as an immigration enforcement as possible. That didn't stem the tide. The backlogs of the immigration system only got worse. The reality is that the system only got more choked up by people seeking protection, waiting unconscionably long to have any kind of result to their case. And this administration has now tried something new. And of course, the last administration, I think many on this call are likely familiar with the creation of the Remain in Mexico program. Send non-citizens into Mexico to await their day in court in hopes that that would disincentivize people, as Polo mentioned, exercising their legal right to seek asylum at our southern border or any of our borders. Once the pandemic started, the creation of the Title 42, the blatant use of a public health, the pretense of a public health order to prevent, not only return people to Mexico to wait their day in court, but just to never have a day in court. This administration has again tried a different tact. Try new things, new ways of somewhat adjusting enforcement in the interior, and then at the border, bringing new policies into place. We're hearing recently about new procedures for Venezuelans and Haitians, Nicaraguans, giving them an opportunity to not seek asylum at the southern border, but instead to go through a new pathway to immigrate to the United States in lawful status, to sort of arrange their status before arriving here. New administration has also tried to change adjudication, to streamline the pathway by which someone seeks asylum, the goal being a quicker result. And advocates are undoubtedly concerned about this. A quicker result is wonderful if the result is just. If the result is not, because someone has been rushed through the system without legal counsel, without the opportunity to prepare their case, then we've created an injustice. And I think that's the struggle with many of these new policies, is an attempt to address a system that is fundamentally broken, that is built for a different population, a different world reality, of who's being processed, how people are being processed, the protections that are afforded them, without any substantive change to the law. We've hoped many times over recent years that there would be a fundamental change to the immigration system to recognize these new realities, to come up with a way that you can address the needs. Polo's comment about the rolling date for registry, I think, is wonderful. I hadn't realized that y'all are working on that, but that's a really creative way of being prepared for an ongoing broken system. But we continue to wait, until there is a fundamental change in a recognition of why people are in flight, who is fleeing. I think we're stuck with The system is going to fail to serve this population. Ultimately, I think we're stuck. We have a asylum law that was defined at the 3/4 of a century ago, that grew out of an international community that was concerned about wars in Europe, that was concerned that defines who gets protection through a lens that only considered who might be in danger in a war in the first world, and not a recognition that people flee for many other reasons, that there are other reasons why harm may be perpetrated upon someone. And all the efforts to really address who we're protecting, how we're protecting them, has been somewhat stagnant for decades. And again, efforts to change that have generally come up short, or have gone in the other direction, have limited access rather than adding it. I think that's a reality that we need to be talking about and recognizing as we're looking at this issue. And I think I'll stop there and welcome any questions.
Okay, thank you. That was just a wonderful review of the big picture around asylum, which I do think we need to think about. I want to encourage people to put questions in the Q&A section, and we will get to them. I have a question, which I think I want to direct mostly to Polo. We've got the whole question about paths to citizenship, and then we've got asylum. So I want to focus a little bit on the first one, partly because that's one of my dearest hopes. But the farm worker bill, and for many people, this was a very carefully worked out bill in the last Congress. It did address a path to citizenship, but it also addressed the need for an expanding workforce here in the country. And I think that's mobilized some opinion in Congress towards a greater expansion of immigration, either visas or path to citizenship. So Polo, I wanted to know if you have much hope for, what I'd call incremental steps with a path to citizenship. And I believe this week we saw in particular in Texas sort of differing wings of the Republican Party debating that, and it gave me a little hope we might catch a few moderate Republicans. So could you comment on the workforce issue and the hope, with potential for hope in the new Congress?
Yeah, definitely. So the economic issue is one that's always at the core of the immigration issue. And this is something that was addressed in previous iterations of larger immigration reform pieces. So the future flow question, right? Back in 2000, I'm trying to date myself now when this is 2009, 2010, the bill back then talked about future flow as and dedicating a department, or not actually an office, that would look at the needs of the labor force to be able to adjust the amount of folks that would be allowed to enter the United States, worker, visas, that kind of thing. So that idea, right, was a bipartisan idea. And that bill actually was a bipartisan bill. And now, those same people are completely against it, which is interesting. But, times change. The future flow question, or addressing the labor force here in the U.S., there is this fear that the U.S. could become like what's happened in Japan, where you don't have, folks having kids. And so, and we're starting to see that in California. There was a significant drop off in terms of births during the course of this pandemic. And so if you're making future projections, right, how do you maintain the economic system that we have, which is based on a workforce, right, that can sustain the folks that are, and this is kind of where the issue of Social Security comes into, right? How do you sustain a system, right? While immigrants are working and their taxes are going into this, Social Security system that we have here in the United States. And so that sustainability comes about through labor, whether folks are getting paid under the table or, you know, they're not quite citizens yet, or as undocumented immigrants, you know, using a social security number, that feeds into a system that is actually sustaining that system. And so when you say, and somebody references HR 29, right? So we don't want, you know, this law would prevent folks from, you know, entering the southern border, and then the attorneys general could, you know, essentially call that out to the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security and make a big stink. And I don't know, but I'm assuming to potentially sue and create a lot of chaos and headaches around this. All for the simple fact that, like, you know, we believe, or the authors of this bill believe, there's too many people coming. The reality is we need workers now. If you're looking at the amount of jobs that are available across the country, if you're looking, even with the technology advancements, even through Zoom, you still need workers. You have a massive gray wave of folks that are retiring in the coming years. And this has been ongoing for the past, you know, 10 years. And you could see, you know, the job postings at your local county here in Los Angeles, you know, they're anticipating 100,000 jobs, right? Who's going to fill those jobs? Somebody has to, right? Everything from the folks that, you know, make sure the, you know, the city hall looks beautiful, to the folks working in city hall. That's the question: is, are we investing in the next generation, in the future workforce? And so if you're looking at sustaining an economic system, you have to find creative ways to make sure that you can sustain that system. And again, you know, when I traveled to Japan, I was really fascinated by all the commercials that, you know, or like the shows talking about this lack of children being born, translating into this economic system cannot sustain itself, and therefore we need to invest in folks having more families and convince our, you know, younger friends and relatives to have kids, you know. So it's something that is a very real threat, I think, in the long run. You know, the younger generations kind of sees themselves in a certain light, and you know, maybe kids aren't in their future. That is a possibility. And so without folks filling these jobs, you know, then we're not going to be able to continue what we have in terms of our economic status as a national power, or, you know, a world power, I should say. So this is something that would bring folks from different parts of the spectrum to come together and address. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act was an example of that. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation. We thought, you know, if anything, right, it's either, you know, the dreamers, right, the folks that have the most kind of sympathy from the American public, but even on just like in economic terms, providing a path to citizenship to the folks that provide food for us, in a bipartisan manner, that does seem to make sense to Republicans and Democrats alike. But we didn't see that manifest itself towards the end of the year. And so these are the big questions I think we will be facing in the coming years, is we continue to see downward trends in terms of population. What do we do then, right? You know, and I leave that to the economists to figure out. But I do always look at Japan as an example of like what could happen when you don't have that continuation, right? The life cycle is just abruptly stopped. It has economic implications down the line.
Oh, great. Errol, do you have a question?
Yes, Jesse, how do people travel to their desired destinations by air if they don't have government issued ID?
That might be a better one for Chris. If not, I'll jump.
Oh, Chris.
Sure, I'm happy to hop in. The short answer is people can travel without federally issued ID or real ID. The process is a little bit harder, but through great relationships with like local relationships with TSA at the San Diego Airport and at Los Angeles International Airport, and with the team at United Airlines and other airlines, we've had great success in training up staff on the ground, TSA staff, to be fully aware of the exceptions to the photo ID rule. It just is the same as if I lost my wallet and I needed to board a flight, there's a process in place for me to board a flight with a lost or missing document. It's just a little bit lengthier. But that is an improvement, I should say, make a plug. That's an improvement. DHS could be issuing travel documents with photo identification to individuals as DHS is releasing them. They do not do that now. That would be a very effective streamlining measure, and it's totally within their power to do it.
Okay. So this is another question for Polo. And I'm going to try to rephrase this to clarify, but what ideas do you and your national partners have for kind of new ideas for legislation? Do you have any ideas up your sleeve?
Yeah, so one of the things to note, so the Dream and Promise Act was introduced by Representative Lofgren here from California. And so she is no longer a representative. The redistricting process kind of eliminated her congressional district, unfortunately. But we also have folks that are interested in continuing to reintroduce pieces of legislation. And so that would be Representative, I believe it's Garcia from Texas, if I'm not mistaken. I'll double check on that. But there are other folks that are taking up that mantle and taking up, passing the torch forward. And so we expect that these bills will be reintroduced, including the registry bill, including farm workforce modernization. I think there is this, these bills are 2-year bills, right? Once they get introduced, and you can fight to try to get it done before the end of the terms. We may see an opportunity present itself. In talking on economic and labor terms, there could be an opportunity that presents itself where folks would be like, oh, you know what, this would be a simple solution to the issue that we have. We have a educated workforce, right? If you're talking about the undocumented young immigrants, they're not so young anymore. That's true. But they have gone to college. They have held jobs, right? We have a lot of folks that are working people that are DACA recipients that are continuing to renew that. So what happens when those DACA if the Supreme Court decides that DACA is unconstitutional? And so you have a massive workforce that is no longer going to be able to continue their jobs because they will no longer have a work permit. And so does that help anybody, right? So the logical question instead of the political talking point is like, logically, does this make sense to, let go of hundreds of thousands of DACA recipients out of sheer, anti-immigrant principle? So I think these are the issues that we are going to be coming across, and that's going to force that conversation in that moment in time for us to be able to address through legislation a path to citizenship. That's why we never give up on moving forward a path to citizenship, because you never know.
Beryl, do you have one?
Yeah, I'm going to throw this out. I don't know who wants to answer it, but with so much focus on asylum seekers, what's going on with the millions who have been working undocumented here for so many years?
Polo?
If it's okay to start.
You again?
Yeah. I look at so what's happening? They're retiring, or their bodies can no longer function the way that they used to, so they can't work anymore. And so in waiting for immigration reform, we actually have a lot of folks that are going to be in a position where there is no safety net for them, because there is no path to citizenship and they're undocumented. And so we have about 11 million people. That number is probably, decreases year after year, even with, asylum seekers at our southern border, even with refugees and all that entails. We still have folks that are from immigrant countries. We haven't addressed that particular, path to citizenship for the 11 million. This is why our membership, who is retiring, we have to figure out ways in California to be creative, to be able to help them, because once they reach that retiring age, or they can no longer work, or they have health issues, there's the Health for All push, the Food for All push here in California. It's because we recognize you've given your life to this country, and now we're going to put you out on the street. That doesn't seem fair. And so in lieu of larger immigration reform, these are the issues that we're going to be facing in the coming years as well, is that, that immigrant workforce is getting older. And we're trying to, again, try to find some creative ways of addressing that. But it's interesting to note also that the population increase that it is happening is not an immigrant population increase. And so there's some studies here in California, and out of Professor Manuel Pastor out of USC, we're starting to see like these are second, third generation folks that are having kids, and not so much reliant on immigrants having children, and that's the increase in population. So yeah, all these fears of like overpopulation, all that's a bunch of nonsense. And that's not exactly what we're seeing on the ground.
I want to add too to that question. I think you're identifying one of the real challenges for those in this space, and that is sometimes conflicting or competing requests for attention, for change. That is, unfortunately, we've seen where advocates are pitted against each other. Where it's happened where, you know, the dreamers are suddenly pitted against the new arrivals, and creating sort of Faustian bargains of who is going to get protection. I think many in this space have tried to not engage that, to not let one be traded for the other, at least in recent years. But I think that's a challenge, and I think that's something that legislatively we have to be really careful about, that it's one group is somehow seen as better or more worthy, and as a result we do something inhumane to a different group.
Okay. So this is one that's a little follow-up on the prior question that I had asked. I'm afraid it's you again, Polo, but this question is, how can people and advocates help and mobilize? It's kind of more the sort of call to action. Do you, and that could be any of the three of you may have some suggestions on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I did mention the comment around planting seeds, right? So this is the time where we sow and then we reap later. Sometimes, you know, there may be opportunities that arise, that's great, but we don't stop the organizing. We recognize now, especially, you know, we try to lift up the voices of the youth that don't qualify for DACA. And so there's high school students graduating every single year, and there's no DACA for them. They're completely undocumented. And so that's a whole generation of folks that can help organize, right, and continue this fight for immigration reform to win a path to citizenship. The other is, you know, we try to look at this in a much broader spectrum. I think what Jesse was talking about is, you know, we don't want to trade off Title 42 for a path to citizenship. We want to be able to address the system in a way that is logical and it makes sense and is humane, but not at the expense of future generations seeking our help. That it's never set a good precedent in the past, right? So punishing, you know, those folks at the border, you know, and, you know, rewarding folks in the interior. And that involves conversations, and taking action, fighting back against anti-immigrant bills that may present themselves, sign-on letters, everything we've always done. But we are really interested in this year in developing relationships outside of California, in those congressional districts that are much more competitive, to be able to put this issue at the forefront, but in a way that is a positive, humane, you know, approach, as opposed to a punitive approach that is a zero-sum game for everyone. So we want to make sure that, you know, wherever there are immigrants, that their voice is heard, because if you don't engage, if you don't start planting these seeds now, we may find ourselves in 2024 in a completely different reality, you know, come November 2024. And then 2025 is that mountain now becomes that much steeper. And so, but when you challenge the status quo or perceptions on immigrants and immigration, and you're hearing from those that are directly impacted, that changes the attitude and perception, or at least the way people talk about it, or neutralizes their stances, or they take on more positive positions. And we've seen that all throughout California. Folks that were anti-immigrant for many years read the writing on the wall, and they said, you know what, we have to be much more inclusive. You know, in Orange County, I'll give you an example. We have this pending Health for All change in the law. All of a sudden, Orange County is talking about inclusion and belonging, and really, and through a health lens. That's not an accident, right? There is an economic stimulus attached to this Health for All. And of course, you know, you want to facilitate folks stepping into the system. Of course, you know, there is jobs to be created and money to be made through that process. So we have to pretend like immigrants are somehow not part of our society and are othered and all that, and really recognize that that change has come. And it's our opportunity to be able to, you know, provide a positive framework and talking points, but also, you know, collectively with one another, and challenging those anti-immigrant sentiments to be able to move this issue forward once and for all.
So Polo, following up on that, someone asked about HR 29. That might be a bill we oppose, and I would think more bills would come in that groups like ours would oppose.
Yeah, that's definitely a bill, right? Because that would impact Chris and Jesse, the work that they're talking about. If folks can no longer apply for asylum at our southern border because it's, the system is impacted, who's going to determine that? HR 29 would prevent folks from being able to, move through that process. They would be detained and then they would be deported back. And that would be it's supposed to make the border secure and safe, but it actually makes the lives of asylum seekers impossible. It makes it dangerous for them on the other side of the border if they cannot petition, if they cannot enter the U.S. and go through the court process of applying for asylum. So yeah, it's dangerous to be playing with laws like HR 29.
And I would add, it does seem with the new Congress, there's kind of this fresh push of laws like that. But it was noteworthy that many moderate Republicans found this law pretty appalling too. So, I think we're going to see how the Republican side plays on immigration because, they recognize the economic need too. And so I have a question, or there's a question here, which is, what are the best arguments to be made to assist the numerous economic migrants to remain legally in this country? Not everybody who should be here who will succeed in making a claim for asylum. So what are the options available? I don't know if, several of you may have some thoughts on that.
So I think
yes, great.
Yeah, go ahead.
For those long-standing members of our community, advocates for a long time recognize that there needs to be a legal pathway. I think that we need to be speaking about, we need to be really addressing the reality of our immigration system. So the fact that not only for most of the world's population is there no pathway to come to the United States lawfully, and that's the reality. Our immigration law is currently very restricted. There, as Polo was talking about, there's a real need economically for folks, for a modern immigration system that recognizes that in the coming decades, we will have economic needs that can either be served thoughtfully through a thoughtful immigration process, or will have real significant economic impacts. I think there's a lot of scholars doing good work about the economic impact of migrants and where our hands are tied currently. And I think we should be looking to those if we're approaching the economic factors. But I don't think we should mix that or allow that to erase the humanitarian factors. Mm-hmm. So U.S. immigration law has for a long time recognized humanitarian protections, and I don't think we should sacrifice those only looking at the economic need to allow certain folks to either come to the United States or to regularize their immigration status.
There's a question, are there any updates to the family reunification parole visas and their ability to stay in the U.S. after the 3-year visa expires?
I'm wondering if that question may be tied to the Afghan evacuees.
Or temporary protected status.
So humanitarian parole is for a limited amount of time, right?
Yeah, so if I assume that question is asking about the Afghan evacuees, is probably many on this call knows after the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan and the very, very quick fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, we know that many, many thousands of Afghan nationals were evacuated to the United States. They were brought here. Many of them spent months either on military bases abroad or military bases here in the U.S. while they were vetted, and then they were given humanitarian parole status, generally 2 years of permission to reside in the United States. But that is a temporary position, as Beryl mentioned. It is not in any way a pathway to permanent immigration status, and they were implicitly told you've got 2 years to figure out what your status is going to be, figure out a way to regularize your immigration status. Many of them have or plan to apply for asylum, and there's many reasons why someone who was evacuated from Afghanistan is likely eligible for asylum in the United States. And so folks are doing that, and based on Congress actually did pass a law mandating the asylum office to prioritize those cases. Afghanistan was also recognized for temporary protected status. That process is ongoing. That, unlike asylum, temporary protected status is just that, it's temporary. There's a lot of talk about an Afghan Adjustment Act allowing those who had been evacuated to the United States to change their status to permanent residence, colloquially a green card. That did not pass Congress. So we don't know yet what it's for those who don't qualify for asylum or TPS at the end of their 2-year parole status. We don't yet know what's going to happen to those folks and what pathway there may or may not be for them.
And TPS is, I think, decided on a country-by-country basis by Congress and often gets renewed. So you're temporary, but then it gets continued, I believe. But it's
so TPS is not, and although to grant someone a TPS is an individualized assessment, for someone to qualify, it's a country-by-country assessment. So the executive branch designates countries for TPS in 18-month increments. So several countries have recently been designated for TPS for 18 months. Just today, Haiti's, they had announced that they were going to extend Haiti's designation for TPS. And today's Federal Register notice came out, again, extending it for 18 months. But there's also no pathway to status from that. When there enough 18-month extensions have happened and the government says that, well, now it's okay to go back to whatever country was designated, people have to go back unless they find an alternative pathway.
Yeah.
Chris, how about volunteers? Don't you use volunteers at your shelter? And
we do, and thank you for
yeah.
mentioning that. Our shelter work depends on volunteers, and we're really grateful for them. We have opportunities to volunteer that are open now. They're available on our website, jfssd.org. If you click through to volunteer and then go to the immigration page, you'll see opportunities. They range from airport guides. We really appreciate the assistance of folks traveling with our guests to the airport, helping them navigate the transportation issues and also the overwhelming nature of clearing security, dealing with government agents and getting to the gate. We have great relationships where great relationships with the airport operator and the airlines, where our volunteers can escort folks all the way to the gate. It's really helpful and impactful. We also have opportunities at the shelter itself, delivering and packaging meals to guests. And there's opportunities as on-call medical advocates to be able to accompany guests if they have medical appointments, to ensure they're being treated with dignity and in a respectful manner. And always there are also opportunities for folks to put their language skills at work if you happen to know a foreign language, particularly if you happen to know one that's less common. You'll be put to work very quickly.
Thank you. You know, I'm just going to take a moment to say that each of the organizations that our three speakers represent is a nonprofit and can always use donations, volunteers in JFS case, and you know, if you want to show your appreciation for the important work that they're doing, that would be one way to do it. There's a question here that I'm going to sort of broaden a little, which is, the question is there any attempt being made to rework U.S. asylum laws? And I would kind of reframe it to say, what would it take to reform U.S. asylum laws? Are there think tanks? How could that occur? I'm looking to Jesse on this one.
I have to ask you to rephrase that one, Jane.
Well, are there any sort of think tanks or legislative groups that are thinking about a revision of U.S. asylum laws? Or would that require kind of a special commission, a new commission on asylum law? What would it take?
Well, that's an interesting one. Changing our asylum law, at least kind of in the big picture, is more or less consistent with international law. Not to say that we can't change it. We can define asylum however we want as a country, and we can certainly be more generous than the international treaties are. But as of right now, it is relatively consistent. So where most of it, and there's problems with that. I mean, again, I believe it's an outdated law that was written in a particular time period. More happens at the policy level, I think. The executive branch publishes regulations how to interpret the immigration law, and that can greatly broaden the applicability of the immigration law, or it can greatly narrow it.
Yeah.
So a lot of work is done every time that the federal government puts out a proposed regulation. A lot of work is done by many agencies to respond, the positive or negative, to what effect that will have. Certainly during the last administration, when a number of regulations were published to really restrict not only asylum eligibility, but just immigration law generally and access by many individuals. Consistently, thousands and thousands of public comments were made. For the moment, that seems to be where a lot of the changes are happening, is in those regulations, responding to public comments, pushing the administration to follow, whatever administration is in power, to follow the Administrative Procedures Act and really give the community the opportunity to do that. And seems to me, Polo might have more, but it seems to me whenever that they actually have followed the APA and put out for public comment, overwhelming, many more comments are generally posted in favor of and non-citizens of expanding or opposing the efforts to narrow the law. So that seems to be where most of things happening. It would be wonderful to talk about really starting from scratch and building a modern, humane immigration law, but that may be a little bit more optimistic than I can be at this point, unfortunately.
Dana, Beryl, do you have another one?
Well, the person who asked about the family reunification executive order has clarified it a little. The mother and daughter, a 13-year-old, were separated in 2017. And the executive order is supposed to help them find each other. So is that working all right? How successful is it?
You're talking
okay, very different. Sorry, I misfollowed that path. And I want to go back to something Chris was saying earlier about a whole of government response. That the effort to reunify parents with children was a whole of government response. There was a court-ordered task force set up to try to get children back with their parents. I'm not directly involved with that, though, so I can't speak to how successful it's been, and what ongoing efforts there are in response to that.
I have one more question. This is from one of our league members who also expresses great appreciation to all of your organizations who do an amazing job to help our immigrant communities. I want to pass that along. So this is a question for Chris and Jesse. The understanding is that the County of San Diego has recently stepped up its efforts to help the immigrant community here in San Diego, such as legal services for those seeking asylum. Do you have any updates on the county's efforts to assist? Chris?
Sure, I can start. That's an accurate depiction. I think that's should give us a sense of optimism that public education and elections matter. There's been a very strong shift in the makeup of the Board of Supervisors in San Diego over the past couple of years, and the results are playing out. Specifically, the county, these are all actions that JFS and our coalition partners have supported. The county created the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs at the county administrative level. That was an investment. And you mentioned legal representation. The county funded in the last budget cycle a really important kind of groundbreaking area of legal services. The Immigrant Legal Defense Program, ILDP, was spearheaded by Supervisor Tara Lawson-Remer and supported ultimately in the budget by the board, and established, it's scaling up. It's a small program, and it's going to require continued investment to move forward, but essentially providing pro bono legal assistance similar to what the Public Defender's Office provides, but for people that are in San Diego County facing removal proceedings. And JFS is one of the several service providers selected as a contractor for that program. And it is in its early stages, and we're really happy to be part of that important work. I don't have any stats to share as of tonight, but it's a good flag for me to be prepared for that one next time. But there's a lot of positive movement with the county, yes.
That's great to know. So we're just past 7 o'clock, and some people may need to have dinner. And I want to thank both the attendees with great questions. And by the way, we do have a survey that will come when you turn off your screens. Please fill it in. It helps us with our planning. But thank you to Polo, Chris, and Jesse. You've been just a terrific explanation and discussion of such a complicated topic. And we really value the work that all three of your organizations do. It's very important. It's a long march with this topic from my point of view, but the League is in it. And one of the reasons that we organize this nationwide group is to try to, reach out to people in other states too. So thank you, and good night to everybody.
Thank you all. Bye.